You are indeed clicking go live. We're live. So here we are, day 52. Wow. Of This Is Not Advice, answering this week questions about ethics in work, really. And more than usual, advice is trying to get to somebody to tell you how to live your life. We're just giving you our answers to these questions. So Min, today.
Yeah, and so this came in the context of what's the slippery slope of things, and we figured one of the questions that can come up in that subject of tricky situations is what does it mean to keep your word? Particularly as maybe you're a startup founder or a salesperson or an employee at a tech company. What does that mean?
Yeah. So this one I have a particular view on because, as you know, I'm an extremist about keeping your word. And of course, if you ask somebody, they'll say, of course I keep my word. Or they'll say, well, I do it except for the situations where I just can't, circumstances change. And between being a liar and being completely reliable are lots of steps in the middle. And I think the more nuanced we can be about it, the better we'll understand. And I'm not trying to excuse any of this, but I'll just say, let's examine it. And in tech, there's even a term of art for this, which may be true in other places too. I just first heard it in tech, which is they say, well, he's not a liar, he's just slippery. And slippery means not quite keeping their word. And, I just say that one thing just generally is being explicit about what you expect in others can cost you. I expect you when you say X, like I'll give you an example. I once had an argument with a founder who he said, you can have up to X in allocation, up to $1 million. And we said, great, we'd like 500,000. He said, well, okay, let me see if I can do that. And it's like, wait a minute, didn't you just say this? And he was really upset at me because he's like, what, you're calling me on it? And yeah, I did call him on it. And I'm pretty explicit about that. And that has benefits, which is people know where I stand, and has costs, which is I alienate people. And you just have to understand what the consequences are of your own behavior. I'll talk a little bit about consequences and being slippery. And so let me just explain what I see as the levels. So the most obvious example of keeping your word is you're precise about what you promised, you adhere to it rigidly, and you communicate reliably about it. Somebody asks you for a clarification, you're there, blah, blah, blah. One level down from that, to me, is imprecise in what you say, but you adhere to it rigidly and you communicate reliably. That's sort of like squirming or getting away on a technicality. Like I remember when I was a founder, this VC wrote me and said, we want to lead your round. And I was like, okay, great. I interpreted that as an offer to lead the round. And he was like, no. We just said we want to lead your round. Like we want to figure it out. It's like, okay. So that's the squirmer. Then you have people who are precise in what they say, but then don't adhere to it rigidly. Like, oh, I know I promised that, but that's a welcher. Like that is somebody who welches on a deal. How much welching, how much slipping is acceptable? Talk about that in a second. And then the next level down, which to me is even worse, is the person who's precise in their speech, adheres rigidly, but is unreliable in whether they communicate. That's the ghoster. That's the person who just disappears, and they're the hardest to deal with. And so, I had a case once where a founder promised us a deal and then he said, well, circumstance changed. Would you reconsider? And I said, no, we shook on it. And the whole point of keeping your word is it's supposed to be independent of circumstances. The only thing that I'd say is that there are norms that can make certain amounts of slipping okay in different places. The challenge with norms is not everybody sees them the same way. People see them differently depending on their seat. So a norm example where it's obviously okay to slip is like you're playing a game, like Werewolf. We play in our, with friends once a month. We used to play in the office, and now we do remotely. In Werewolf, you're supposed to lie to other people, so of course it's okay. But there are cases where we had an investor change after the term sheet, and they said, well, we learned something new. I was like, yeah, but in venture, we almost always, like 99.9% of the time, stick to the terms unless something we couldn't have known comes up that's material. And the last thing I just say is, how do you know if you've kept your word? To me, one of the main questions is, did it have a price? If it turns out that you just justify it every time it's inconvenient, you slip, then you're probably not keeping your word. And by the way, it might not have consequences. I once told the founder, look, you can welch on this deal. It probably won't hurt you in the long run. There's no karma that always reliably comes back to bite people. It's why it's so satisfying when it does come back to bite people or help them in the case of good karma. but you just have to decide what kind of person you want to be.
And like in your experience, you've laid out these, like the three kind of the mental model, right? Of like, what is it that you say? How often do you stick to it? And then how reliable are you about it? Have you noticed, is it possible for people to go between the categories that you laid out?
100%. I mean, I've seen people who, I don't think any of this is innate to personality. I think it might be related to personality, but there are plenty of people who are super reliable in one circumstance and then not in another. And like oftentimes, we could talk separately in another question about how do you get somebody to keep their word, but we've discussed curious before furious here. Sometimes the reason somebody welches is a thing you can't see. It's a gun to their head. I mean, in a metaphorical sense, or like they became unreliable in communication because they went through a divorce or whatever it is. And so respect for life circumstances and difference, I think, is really important. If you value relying on the other person, then you got to ask them what their norm is and be explicit about yours, which is part of the reason, record videos like this is so if people want to know where we stand on this stuff, they can know. Yeah.
And I think that's a reflection of also like some of our team's core values around transparency, right? It allows us to be clear up front. Like Netflix also does this with like their culture deck. They're like canonical, famous culture deck. Like, this is who we are. This is what our values are. And like and how that reflects like the kinds of decisions they make and what it means to keep their word about how they behave, right?
Yeah. I mean, nobody is for everybody. And if you're in an environment where like you're in a bazaar where you're negotiating prices, okay, then like the price is not the price. If you don't like that, don't shop at the bazaar. But that's why in the business world or organizational world, communicating with others is so important to try to match where your norms are.
Yeah. And I think that we have like two really good questions that come up out of this, which we can talk about in the next episode. Wait, how do we get somebody else to keep their word? And then I have another one, which is like, what happens if you did break your word and how do you recover from that?
Gosh, that's such a good one. I mean, because we've all done it, right? We've all had guilt around it. Oftentimes the reason we do it is we don't keep our word is we're ashamed to let somebody in on the bigger picture. Oh, I got my arm twisted by my mother or whatever the thing is. So yeah, let's talk about those. Those are really good ones.
Cool. Well, we'll be back tomorrow and every weekday for This Is Not Advice. If we try to share what we learn here about the future of work. So if this is helpful to others, if you're curious about hearing the next episode, feel free to share.
And ask us a question. Thank you, Min. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.